Good morning. It is Dorothy from the Death in Cambodia, Life in America podcast. Everybody, welcome to another amazing episode. I am so excited to have our guest on for us today. I think she brings so much value. She's so passionate about not only art, but policy. Her name is Amara Goel, and she is a 1.5 generation Cambodian American, the first internationally recognized Cambodian soprano with Western classical training, as well as a policy analyst and a social impact writer. I mean, truly, she's got so many passions and she's so great at so many different aspects. I feel like not only in art, but in policy making, which I'm so excited to get into today. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Voice from the Moores School of Music at the University of Houston and has appeared in Where Elephants Weep, Sun and Sea, and the Winds of Angkor. And so we know her because Where Elephants Weep, we actually had Catherine Filo on here before, who's the playwright of that. And with a master's in global policy studies, she also is currently an evaluation consultant at the UN, International Labor Organization, working on eradicating child labor and forced labor. It is just so amazing to have you on today. Mara, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I admire your work so much, Dorothy. So it's an honor to be here.
I think we had a conversation prior to this podcast, and it really made me think about not only all the things that you are doing on both just like the artistic side, but the policy making. The thing that kind of stood out to me is that you are a 1.5 generation. And what that means is that you were born in the camps, specifically Khao Dang, if I'm not mistaken. So tell me, I kind of want to take it back because the reality is I feel like there are a good amount of 1.5ers who listen to this podcast, and you can speak to them in a way that is maybe different from me because I was born here in America. And when I think about all the amazing things that you've been able to do so far in your life, whether it be kind of in art, in opera, singing, or in trying to make policy changes, I wonder if all these passions are kind of linked back to the fact that maybe in some way you're growing up and being born in a refugee camp may have fueled some of these things. So wanted to take it back. Do you remember in the camps, and what was your childhood experience like?
Thank you for that question. Such an important one. So I don't have any memories. I was brought to Houston, Texas to resettle with my parents brought me to Houston when I was 5 months old. So I don't have a working memory. And that presents a pretty unique position, right? Because as people in our community, as people with inherited trauma, we absolutely experience the trauma on like a cellular level, yet we don't have firsthand memories to draw from. And so I always say it's kind of like building a bridge out of a hairstring and trying to put the pieces together. It's like a lifelong journey of understanding as displaced people, like making sense out of the nonsensical in some way.
Right.
So I do feel, thank you so much for putting kind of words to it, because I didn't know about this term 1.5 generation. And I always considered myself first generation, though I have the lived experience of a second generation, right? I navigate cultures and the duality of the environment and the duality of my identity the way that a second generation would. However, I still was born in a UNHCR refugee camp without a birth certificate. So, I still can't say, I can't say that I was a natural born citizen. I was naturalized. And I do have a relationship with our mother culture that's closer, I think. I hold it in a different space. So, I wear sarongs at home, and I feed my family brahok sauce, and I'm always yearning in every way that I can to be closer to my mother culture. And so there's definitely that. And my upbringing was, if we take it all the way back, we resettled in Texas, and my parents, as with many Cambodian families, followed in the footsteps of people who showed them the ropes how to establish a donut shop. So I came from a donut family. And so you and I might be cut from a very similar cloth, Dorothy.
Yes, very close.
We I grew up working at the donut shop as a child and helping out. And I feel like that experience, aside from the physical labor part of it, which
Hmm.
is like an intrinsic part of resettling refugee families, is that we're really hard workers, right?
Right.
I reflect on that a lot and what impact, especially working in the United Nations on child labor issues.
Mhm.
I'm always trying to connect the dots and what impact that it's had on who I've become. But I think what's really special when I think about that period in my life is the ways that my parents were so resilient in their interaction through the donut shop, their interaction with the community. Houston is a huge hub for resettled refugees, like so many waves, right? So it's such a diverse place. And through the donut shop, we had so many interactions with people who have gone there for generations, I would say. Kids that grew up with me buying our donuts, their parents would, have our coffee and they would know us by name and they would know where I'm studying and what we're doing in life. And these are people with so many backgrounds that are different from ours. And that's how we integrated culturally. And that
Yeah.
was something that sustained us financially. So I find it exciting that other young people in other parts of the world, especially in the US, who have very similar experiences
Mhm.
in terms of, well, there's the donut aspect for sure, but then there's also this yearning for making sense of all of this and trying to kind of understand how we became to be and who we actually are. These questions of identity is like a really, really long-winded one, and one that we continue to sort of try to help each other parse out.
Right. No, I
Um,
think what you've said so many great points there, and speak to the 1.5er specifically, and I'm so glad that I was able to set a term to exactly what you probably had been looking for, because you are exactly right. Having one foot being closer to Cambodian culture than you would probably say for second generation who were born here, but also being raised here in America from such an early age. I mean, from before memory. And so having one foot in each. And what I've always heard from the majority of people that I speak to who are 1.5 is that very same struggle that I feel like you just described, specifically with identity and trying to comb out, how much of you is Cambodian and how much of you really feels like American. I mean, people who are born here also get that identity crisis, but I feel like your generation, specifically that 1.5, that in between, feels it so much more because you weren't really born, you weren't born here, but you were here from since memory. And so those two things have its own very unique experience.
mm,
Can
mm,
you describe a little bit your when you started feeling this identity questioning? I don't want to call it a crisis, but were there moments in Texas, and at what age did you start feeling like, "Oh, I feel a little bit different?" And what were some of the struggles that you felt like you dealt with as a child and kind of going into your teenage years?
I think, if I'm honest, I probably might have always felt like I was on the outside looking in some way. I think, fortunately, I grew up in such a diverse context in Houston that,
Mhm.
everyone had a uniqueness. Everyone was different in some way. But I think, particularly in the Texas context, there's a dominant voice. Houston is very, very diverse. You drive out for 45 minutes, and it changes really quickly, and so does the outlook and the complicated things that come with a more homogenous culture.
Mhm.
So so there was always that. I claim Texas as my own. So I love going to small town Texas, and I love the small town culture, just driving through the plains for hours and hours and seeing horses and cattle. And I really,
Mhm.
really love that. And at the same time, there isn't a lot of people who look like me in a lot of that terrain.
Mhm.
And so there is this duality of feeling very much at home and also, however, always being some sort of feeling like I'm an outsider. And
Mhm.
so I think there's a parallelism there with like my artistic life as well, because
Mhm.
I ended up studying opera. And we can get to that more. But in the operatic world, in my earlier studies, it was just Western music. And it's fantastic stuff because we're talking about like Baroque music and classical voice and the mechanics of it and the history. And there's so much beauty that really speaks to me. Until I found Cambodian projects later on in my university life, and actually we're Elephant Sweep, if I'm honest.
Mhm.
I was always an outsider looking in. And
Mhm.
so there was absolutely a sense of what's the word? Like not faking it till you make it, but an imposter syndrome,
Mhm.
if you will. So, I also claim that space as my own because I embodied it and I feel that I mastered it to a degree. I earned my bachelor's degree and I have a really deep love for Western opera. I
Mhm.
always will. But I had to create my own footing in that. There was no one before me who was able to show me. And that journey was as complicated and as beautiful and as rewarding as it might sound. So I think in terms of identity, I'm not sure that I actually found a place where I felt like I fully embodied myself until I found other people in the diaspora who, and not in Cambodia, because once I'm in Cambodia, I realize how American I actually am. And while there's like an essential feeling of being at home there, when I go to Lowell, Massachusetts, or when I go to Long Beach, California, I'm just like, that's my people because there's a commonality of, I'm both of these things and the multiple belonging is really, really important to embrace.
Yeah, yeah. Something that I feel like a lot of first time artists, and when you mention that, I think about also how that kind of relates to like chefs and cooks and how, for example, the Western flavors and profiles, although they're really great, are generally held as kind of I'd say like the Michelin standard, right? There's always that debate between what is considered like top tier, but and that struggle for kind of the Eastern flavors, I'm just thinking about food, Eastern flavors to kind of navigate their way towards that, and how that may be kind of similar to this art and the opera. And so you being one of the first sopranos that are, like Western trained sopranos, you really did have to kind of break the way for all the other people to come after you. And so tell me a little bit about your introduction to art and how did art make you feel and what role did it play in kind of your healing journey?
So when I was a young, I guess I was in junior high, I've always known that I had a creative heart. We worked really hard as a family, running a small business. And so I think there is a like rhythmic monotony that comes with donut life. And
Mhm.
I always knew that there was something that I yearned for that was different, that I had something to offer the world that was very, very different.
Mhm.
When I was in junior high, I was a star painter. And so before going into high school, my name was one of two star students who she gave to the high school teacher to say, watch out for these two because these are, watch those two because they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And then she found out that I chose to go into choir and she confronted me and she said, why? Like, what are you doing? And
I saw the potential in you.
I want to sing and I was literally a closet singer. It was always just in the shower. I knew that I could carry a tune. but I had never actually sung in public until I joined choir in freshman year of high school. And I excelled fairly quickly as a soloist. And so my high school teacher recommended me for solo lessons, and my parents mustered the money for me to get voice lessons continuously. And then I excelled in state level competitions. And I didn't know any different. I didn't think too hard about it, to be honest. I didn't contemplate whether I can make a living. That probably would have been a good thing to contemplate, but I just thought, I find myself really good at this thing. It gives me joy and it's taking me somewhere, and I'm going to see where it takes me. And so when it was time to apply for universities, I didn't actually tell my parents that I was applying for these music schools. I had my uncle drive me to audition for some scholarships, and I received a few, and I had some options. And so when I went to my parents, the framing of the question was, do you want to pay for my education or do you not? And so I didn't really give them a choice. And they were very supportive, to be fair. So I started my bachelor's degree at Sam Houston State University, which is a small town. Well, it was in Huntsville, Texas, which is a small town. The university itself is quite big. And my mentoring professor who brought me there, who helped me earn these scholarships, he was one of my judges at some of the competitions, and he more or less scouted me, and he showed me what a university degree in this could be like. So I went to study with him, and he moved on a couple of years later to Baylor University in Waco, and it would have been a wonderful school to continue my studies at, but I preferred to go back to Houston. So I went to the Moore School of Music, and that's nothing to scoff at. They're a wonderful degree, and I really got to perform in professional class operas like La Boheme and Tales of Hoffmann and others. So I'm really, really grateful for having gone to University of Houston as well. And when I was a junior at the University of Houston, not having finished my degree yet, my aunt, who at the time was living in San Francisco, went to a recital for a Cambodian tenor at the time. And she spoke to him afterwards, and she said, my niece is studying opera in Houston. And he said, what? Who is she? Like, why don't we know who she is? So he connected me to Cambodian Living Arts in Cambodia at the time. And they were developing Where Elephants Weep, which was the first rock opera and still is. And I connected with them. They requested an audition video, or it was a recording, and I promptly made one, sent it to them, and within months I was on a plane on my first contract to Cambodia. And this opera took 10 years to produce and to develop. So what that means for me is a lot of opportunity to participate and learn. And that first trip to Cambodia in 2003, it wasn't my first trip to Cambodia, but it was the first trip on my terms and as an artist. And I met lifelong friends. I met Katrine Fiyu, who is the librettist of the opera, and Dr. Him Sophi, who is the composer. I met Arn Chornpond, who is the founder of Cambodian Living Arts, also a longtime friend, Chat Pirsath. The list it goes on. But these are people who've really helped to guide my journey in building my own relationship with Cambodian and as a Cambodian artist. And I think when I think back on that trip, I knew that it was transformational as it was happening, but I didn't know what the rest of my life would look like. It was just like overwhelming. It was beautiful, and it gave me clarity on what artistic life as a Cambodian with Western training could look like and could be. And I think a lot of artists find that certain shows were able to give them a lot of artistic life, and Where Elephants Weep was that for me.
Was it during that time that you had realized that you really identified as a Cambodian artist and that you wanted to do more works around that were Cambodian? Because when we look at the art after you created this, it really truly seemed that you kind of gravitated towards kind of raising Cambodian voices and doing Cambodian stories. And I don't know if in the beginning when you started when you first started your introduction to art and your relationship with it, I wasn't sure if that was the direction you wanted to take, but I'm curious on if it was after that opera that you decided, okay, actually, I am a Cambodian artist and that's the art that I want to do. Would you say that's correct?
Yes, I think very much so. Though, and I think it allowed me access to my own courage to do that and to own that identity and to see that there was space for me, because it's really hard to force that when you feel that there's no one in that space with you. A collaboration like that is so rare and unique, where you have people with world class talent who are speaking about a subject matter that was so core to my being. And I'm not sure if you've seen Where Elephants Weep, but it's right now it's on Broadway on demand, and I think you can get it for like $3.99, which is a
Mhm.
huge feat. That now that it's accessible to the public, it's the story is so powerful, even for my friends who have seen it who are not Cambodian. A lot of the dialogue after seeing that show sounds something like, I had no idea what was going on, and what how dynamic that story is. Not only was it telling the story of Cambodia's past, present, and future, but I think musically there was a marriage of two genres that was so much a part of. I don't want to say that it was who I am, because I was still I still very much am exploring artistically what it could look like, but it was the first example of how transformative performing arts could be for me. And this first um, uh, workshop that I was a part of in 2003 was such an incredible experience, and a collaboration with artists in Cambodia and some from the U.S. The musical director, Scott Stafford, amazing guy. He's in California, and there were partners like him, and John Burke from Vermont was there as the executive producer, and Robert McQueen, who's the director. He's Canadian. It was such a diverse collaboration of people who were passionate about the Cambodian story and telling this story that Katrine had written. And for me, I think I spent a lot of those weeks just overwhelmed by taking it in. It felt like the floodgates had opened, and really it did. It did. It me to a world where I had new tools to explore who I was, and I felt very grateful. I felt really lucky to be in that position. And it wasn't until the premiere in 2008 in Phnom Penh that um, up until then, I felt like I was gatekeeping. Like, it's not really possible to share what that experience could be like. And once the production was staged and then it was televised, and then it was then that I felt seen and heard, and really proud to be able to present that to the world. And I had a much smaller part in the televised version. The show itself, I mean, no one has a small part in a production like that. There's all sorts of involvement that's not on the screen. But I played Miss Angkor, and exploring the journey of a beer girl in modern day Cambodia was very educational and really like emotional and an empathic journey for me.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think Where Elephants Sweep is one of those shows that only comes once in a lifetime. And it truly has thus far. And there's so many other projects that I worked on, as you were alluding to, that speak of issues that I care about. And so you're right in that regard, that was the first project that spoke to me in such a profound way. And then after that, I've definitely gravitated to projects that, you get to be a little bit picky after a while, that it would be essential that the arts that I produce would have to speak to people and to speak to myself. And so not all the projects that I've embraced have had to do with my Cambodian identity. Like Sun and Sea
Mhm.
is an opera that is about climate change, and it is impactful in its own way. And it's a Lithuanian opera that I had
Mm.
the privilege to be a part of at the Paris Philharmonic in 2003. So it's an example of an opera that is just as profoundly transformative and not necessarily on a Cambodian subject. But I think my experience through Whirl and Sweep allowed me to branch out in a few different ways, not just artistically, but that was also my segue into policy work.
Mm. Hmm.
So I really feel like, my relationship to Cambodia is really where so many of my life decisions stems from, and everything that I decide, it feels like at hindsight, almost everything was informed by
Hmm.
by my Cambodian identity, and then by the experience of yearning and of trying to piece together like who I am.
How much of the Khmer Rouge history did you know going into Where Elephants Weep? And were you taught that in high school? Because I wasn't taught it in my middle school, and I had a little bit of it in my high school, but barely. And so, yeah, I'm curious to know, how much did you know, and how did that experience relate and fuel your Cambodian identity?
Mhm.
I know you've kind of already mentioned it, but I wonder what that really feels like. You probably felt so validated in a way that you didn't think you needed to be after the launch of that opera. And so, yeah, I'm curious, how much did you know about the Khmer Rouge prior?
So in public education in Texas, I would say did not cover it, not even once. And we talked about the Vietnam War,
Yes.
but there was always a confusion on my part in terms of how to talk about it, and I actually didn't understand. So my parents were fortunately very open about talking about their experiences, but like many trauma situations, the stories that they told were nonlinear. They
Hmm.
were piecemeal, and I felt like it was my job to then piece it all together and make sense of it. And I didn't understand where our conflict fell in the context of what was going on in Southeast Asia and the Vietnam War at the time. So those are things that I had to piece together myself before the information era, and I'm aging myself a bit. So this was during the time before the internet and before we had everything at our fingertips. If I wanted to know something like that, I had to go to the library to
Hmm.
read about
Right.
it. And as an indication of how big that void was, it must have been fourth grade that someone asked me what country I was from. And most of the non white and non black kids in my class at the time were Mexican.
Mm.
So I wasn't Mexican. I was something else. I wasn't Chinese. I was too dark, and I said, I'm from a place called Cambodia. And he said I was lying because there's no such country. And he went and asked a substitute teacher. And she told me I was lying because there's no such country.
Substitute teacher?
Yes,
My
absolutely.
goodness.
And the submissive child that I was, I looked at her and I said, "Oh, maybe I am lying." And I went home and I told my parents, and my parents just laughed it off. When I think back at it, I really understand that as peacemakers, they're not going to go and confront the school. If that happened to my child today, I would give a polite email saying, this is what my son has said, and let's talk about this. This is not the way in which my parents knew how to survive the world.
Sure.
And so they didn't see the harm in that. But looking back, that's just one indication of how inadequate the education system was in informing the next generation these really important things. It's a place where thousands of Cambodian refugees resettled, and yet no one cares to acknowledge what happened. So I feel very fortunate that growing up in my household, my parents were very communicative and they talked about their experiences. They still do. Unfortunately, I lived outside of the country for almost 8 years now. I'm currently based in London. So I don't have access to my parents. And I do feel, well, I speak to them, but I would love to have access to them every day. I feel a sense of urgency that we need to talk more about this. And I hear stories over and over again, but every time I hear them, I learn something new. There was a new detail. There was a new way to think about it and talk about it. And there are new conclusions that I can draw because of my own wisdom. So
Hmm.
I feel this sense of gratitude that my parents have been able to give me what they can and do their part, and everything else was up to me to build my own relationship with Cambodia, and eventually as an artist, as a mother, and as a policy analyst and a social impact writer. So I didn't know much, but once I was in Cambodia, it was like
Crash
it was
course.
was a crash course in every sense of the word, because
Yeah.
there's a smell, and
Mhm.
there's a fatigue. There's just trying to make sense of the juxtaposition of the complicated challenges of a developing country post-war, trying
Mhm.
to grapple with identity, after the war, after 90% of the artists had been executed. What happens to a society that has been mutilated such that the educated and the art makers were murdered?
Mhm.
And how then does an entire generation of mostly young people grapple with that and survive? And at the same time, Cambodia is so beautiful. Um, there's so much humanity and clarity to be learned by just the human resilience that's before us when you go to Cambodia and you see how kind the Cambodian character that my parents talk about, was very, very clear and evident to me. So I think a lot of my understanding about the Khmer Rouge and Cambodian history as it is now has to do with a lot of retrospective understanding.
Mhm.
In policy school, in my work experience now, I'm able to revisit and look at the history in the context of geopolitical interest, in the context of the domestic social dynamics inside Cambodia. Um, and then in the context of my family and how my parents were able to come together, without which I wouldn't exist. My parents married
Right.
under the Khmer Rouge regime. But I
Mm.
think before my education, knowledge about the genocide and about Cambodia existed probably more in a rudimentary way. I knew the numbers, I knew the global figures, I knew how many deaths, I knew, April 17th, Phnom Penh was emptied. Um, I it was very cerebral, and I feel like now there's very much I can embody all of that, and it's between the head and the heart is where I hold all of that.
Right. Right. The reason why I think it's really incredible when I speak to Cambodian artists is there is that unfortunate fact that during that horrible time period, the majority of artists were targeted. When I talk to current Cambodian artists, a lot of them similarly have this same feeling of and drive and passion behind their art really stems from this idea that they're just not we were basically kind of rebuilding our own culture and rebuilding our own art because it
Mhm.
was taken away from us.
Mm, mm,
And
mm,
so I
mm,
wonder too if that's how you feel when you think about being a Cambodian artist.
mm, mm.
Is that a driving force for you, or do you have any relationship to that fact?
I think my identity is so transient, right? So I grew up in Texas, having been born in a UNHCR refugee camp, brought over as a baby. Through my education and early adulthood, I've lived on both coasts in the United States, in both Boston and Santa Barbara for a short time. Then, through my education, I studied abroad in Spain, and my master's degree was in the University of Texas at Austin. But my internship, I was very lucky to land an internship at the United Nations in Switzerland. And then after that, I married and joined my husband in Norway. And then we lived in India for 2.5 years
Oh,
and then
wow.
moved to London for now 4 years. This week is our 4-year anniversary of being here in London. So I think my experiential identity is like a prism. There's so much, and I cannot say that I am not still unpacking it. Like there's just so much to draw from that.
Mhm.
And so my relationship with Cambodia is also holding steady my experiences in all of these places that I've lived and navigating cultures and people and political systems
Mhm.
and wearing different hats. So, because I'm not just an artist, but I do social impact work. So, when I think about Cambodian arts, there is an essence to learning. It's like the backbone to the arts in Cambodia is the traditional arts, and Cambodian living arts is the organization that I find is my home in Phnom Penh and in experiencing the arts preservation. It's a wonderful thing that they do that has gone from pairing master artists with students to carry on the oral tradition. And that was the earlier iterations of the organization. I believe they still do that, but now it has transformed, their mission has transformed into fostering new forms of art. And under this belief that in order for arts to exist, it has to evolve. And that's what makes it a living art.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so that evolution can look so many different ways, and the young people in Cambodia are doing it. There's so much happening. It's nothing short of a renaissance right now.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I'm a little bit jealous. I want to be there on the ground, to participate and to witness, to bear witness to what's happening. But in film, there are amazing things happening. There's Shu Davi and Kavit Niang, and these are students of Rati Pan, who is the Oscar-nominated filmmaker under his Wopana Center in Cambodia. And it's just one example or two examples of really amazing establishments doing pioneering things to foster this type of new identity that Cambodia is growing into.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I do feel very much like the more tangible thing that's happened, that we had almost 2 million people perish in the genocide. So there's like this void. And
Mhm.
then suddenly, like, there's a new growth spurt in both population and arts and economics. And in the arts, it's complicated because there's a grappling for the past. And when there's very few strings to hang on to, there, I think, is an impulse to look to our neighbors, to look to Korea, to Thailand and to lots of other cultural traditions, and that can become something beautiful. But I think there's something to be said about looking back into ourselves and bringing out who we are in our authentic voice, because
Mhm.
there's such a wealth voice to draw from there.
Mhm.
So I hope to
Mhm.
see more of that. And I think it's happening. It really is. So, more power to that, I hope, in the future. And that's a really good segue into some of the things that I hope to be involved in coming up
Yeah.
soon.
Yeah. I think it's amazing that you've been able to express yourself in through art, but not only through art, but also through policy. And so we know that you had an internship at the UN, and currently right now you are working with the UN still. It's incredible that you've also have this passion to try to work on the changes on the policy side as well. And I know that currently one of the things you're working on is eradicating child labor. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one of the things that you are researching and working on. And it wasn't a surprise to me to read that about you, because I'm thinking about, again, just the Khmer Rouge. During the Khmer Rouge, child labor and forced labor were absolutely strategies during that 4-year period. And so I'm curious on, one, have you always just been interested in making social change? You've always been that kind of person. Where does that passion kind of stem from, and your
Mhm.
drive for that stem from? And again, do you believe that any of that is related to your past and, your relationship with Cambodia and the war-torn country that it used to
Mhm.
be?
To answer one of your questions, I was reminded at some point that for my undergraduate degree, my alternative to studying opera or studying voice was political science.
Mm.
And I'd forgotten that I'd listed that, and I'm glad that I was reminded of that by my professor, who happened to come across an old application or something. And he said, didn't know this about you. And I thought, yeah, I've always been driven to like recognize the unspoken with a drive to reconcile injustices that I see. Whether or not I had the wherewithal to have any impact, there was always kind of a mounting sense of something should be done. And it went from something should be done to I'm going to try to do something about this. And I think I remember viscerally gaining sort of the sense of agency when I was in Cambodia as a performer. I was on contract, but I think I was giving a performance. It was a recital and it was a small venue. I was singing Puccini opera, and I just remember that the people that I saw coming to hear me sing, it almost felt silly to me because I thought, yes, cultural preservation is really important. People need to feel, um, you know, a sense of identity. And yet, most immediately, they need clean water. They need adequate nutrition, access to education, harmony and peace, and the feeling that of security, and of comfort and of the stability that I had in Texas. And it was almost immediate that I knew that something was stirring inside of me and that I could offer something else. And so that was when I warmed up to the idea of what could that path look like. And it doesn't have to be so different from me as a performing artist. And now, years later, I can say that, with confidence, that you don't have to do just one thing. You can do many things. You can run a donut distribution company and also have a podcast that's awesome, and I could be a performing artist and also educate myself on how to make change. So I applied for one school and I didn't think that I would get accepted. It was actually, I probably got accepted by a hair, or so I think, but I did. And I got into a master's program at the LBG School of Public Affairs in University of Texas at Austin. And that started my journey into really learning about, the nuts and bolts of policy, of, what my impact could look like. And that paved the way towards the United Nations. And I am an advocacy writer as well. My other big client is World Vision. And the two strands of research that I do is in global hunger. So for 3 years in a row now, I've written their flagship report on the global hunger crisis that was spurred by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then also the Sudan crisis that happened last year. I released a report about that for World Vision. And with the United Nations, really, it was an opportunity for me to work on a program that it's called the 8.7 Accelerator Lab under the ILO, the International Labor Organization. 8.7 stands for SDG 8.7. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, but the United Nations established in 2015 17 goals for the world that required multilateral collaboration. Goal number 8 is for decent work and economic prosperity. 8.7 stands for child labor and forced labor under its worst forms. And I was hired 3 years ago as the monitoring and evaluation consultant for this. So I'm brought in to measure impact that UN pilot programs have across Africa and parts of Asia, to measure our impact towards the goal of eradicating child labor and forced labor as per the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think in terms of the connectedness, I have a passion for social issues, but my opportunity to work on labor issues and forced labor and child labor is purely by luck, if I'm honest. I think any opportunity to work with the United Nations should be one to be considered, depending on the agency, if you ask me now. But I feel very fortunate that I'm working with the institution that sets the international standards. So in terms of my process and working on these issues, it's an interesting question. It's one that I think about a lot because these issues are profoundly meaningful to me. And I do find myself needing to navigate the space between my head and my heart in order to deal with massive amounts of data and to write these intricate reports that are based on numbers and interviews and policy achievements. I have to get really cerebral, right? And at the same time, I have to allow myself a different space to have the emotional response, because these are not just numbers I work with. It's perception of numbers, but it's human beings. And I have a vantage point as someone with a lived experience as a refugee and who has access to stories and the realities of what is happening on the ground in Sudan, and in all these countries that I work with through the lens of my family's Cambodian experience and my Cambodian experience. And so there's a weight there. There is an emotional weight and a sense of importance that sometimes comes at a cost, but other times I think is definitely more of a blessing. So yeah, sometimes it becomes overwhelming what the meaning of the work is, and yet I have to manage that. Otherwise, it becomes unsustainable.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, a sense of responsibility, I would assume. And I think it's incredible that you've been able to do that because I feel, not I'm sure a lot of children of refugees, if you ask any one of us, we can probably speak to the impacts of genocide and the impacts of we live it, we feel it on an everyday basis. And so, but not all of us have been able to strike that perfect balance and actually find a career in it. And so I think it's amazing that you've been able to achieve that, and the passion that you have, I can definitely see, yeah, is very interrelated to who you are and your experience and and our parents' experience.
Mm.
And although as heavy as that can be, I can only see it as extra fuel and something that makes you even better for the position that you are in now, being in the United Nations and having that extra perspective that other people won't be able to quite understand. And so, I think everything that you've done is amazing in the way that you've been working on the arts and doing the cultural preservation on that side, and also being able to lean into policy making and writing and change and using your experience as a 1.5er, somebody, a child of refugees, to touch on so many different aspects of this. And so I appreciate you coming on. I think this is just so, what a conversation to be had. Your journey has been so unique, but yet at the same time, you've been able to find ways to be impactful in everything that you've been able to touch. And I think that just goes to show your dedication, your passion. It tells us a story of exactly, the kind of person you are. And I think I'm so glad that we have people like you in in big institutions like the United Nations, who can speak for us and also have the power to make that change.
Thank you so much. I think your words mean so much to me. Actually, I'm a big admirer of your work because it's so essential that we are seen and we see each other. And I think there should be more platforms like yours that sets a model for what this could look like. So thank you so much for all of your work.
Yeah.
And thanks
For
for
any
having me.
If anybody wants to find you, also, what are your plans for the future? I think then we can kind of figure out where to find you afterwards. But where are you at right now in life?
Mhm.
What are your plans for the future? What do you have going on?
I think most immediately, I am working on an event coming up very soon. Details are to be determined. This is around the opera and Royal Sweep, and I'm teaming up with Katrine Fiyu, the librettist, and Dr. Himsa P, the composer, with together with Penn International, which is an organization that works with writers who work on human rights issues. And so that's very exciting. So I encourage you to watch
That
that
is
space
exciting.
coming up. And that's all we have in terms of details for that. In terms of my personal journey, my research on global hunger with World Vision is published today. And today is the 18th of March.
Hmm.
So that drops today, and the research that I do helps people to understand food access disparities through a really unique way. My research measures the price of food in terms of how many hours it takes to work to earn a standard food basket. And to give you an example, I hope I have this number right, but it takes about 1 hour of work to earn this food basket in the United States. But you'll find, if you read the report, that in some much more difficult contexts in some countries, it takes over a week. And so it helps us to understand that although there's enough food to feed the world for whatever reason, not everyone has access. And this is something that's going on just under our noses. The other thing that I'm working on is, and this is something that is a personal healing project for me, but I'm really, really interested in um, developing my writer's voice as a poet. So
Mhm.
all poetry that I keep to myself for now, but that's a space that I'm going to definitely try to develop going forward.
Well, I am so excited to follow along on that journey with you. Amada, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and sharing your journey with us. I will definitely be linking all the different links, especially Where Elephants Weep, as you said, is currently out now and it's very accessible for anybody to watch. And also a few of the links of the reports that you had worked on. Thank you again so much for coming on here. I know that all the listeners out there will be able to listen to this and find so much value out of your journey. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing and for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Dorothy.